our lives dramatically changed on January 6, 1995. None of us was ever the same again.
It changed how we raised our kids. It changed how I did my business. It changed my relationship with my wife. It changed everything.
January 6th, 1995, for me, came as a very unexpected day. It started out rather normally. I had a busy schedule. I'd had a busy week. I would say that the truth is, for me, it had not been a particularly spiritual week. I had spent the week training a crop of radio salespeople. I'm a broadcaster. And before I left the house that morning, I told my wife, I'll probably knock off early today. It was not to be. The first thing I had on my agenda was I was doing an 8:30 a.m. interview with a guest speaker who was in the area doing a series of meetings at a local church, the Tabernacle. Now, we've been friendly with the Tabernacle for a long time. Jamie Buckingham had pastored that church for many years. He made regular visits down to Vero Beach, so we knew them well. We had a great relationship with the Tab, and they had brought in a man by the name of Randy Clark, who was well known at that point already from what was called the Toronto blessing or the Toronto outpouring. Now, I consider myself a very rational person. I've seen a lot of what I would call Pentecostal charismatic excesses in the course of my life. And frankly, I was a little worried about bringing Randy in for the interview. So although I don't normally do interviews at this point in my life, and I didn't even then, I decided, look, I'm going to do this interview personally because I want to make sure it doesn't get out of hand, or that we don't come across like we're endorsing some kind of activity. I just was very interested in the fact that we reach a very broad group of people, did then, still do, from a lot of different theological backgrounds. And so we're always trying to navigate that very carefully. And so I thought, I'll do the interview myself, make sure it doesn't get out of hand. So we're doing the interview, and I always remember the topic. We're talking about the difference between the manifest presence of God and the omnipresence of God. And so we're having this conversation about the manifest presence of God, and all of a sudden, all I can say is something started happening in the room. And the way it first began to manifest is one of my staff members suddenly began to just almost vibrate violently, like he's having a seizure, and then he falls on the floor.
I looked down beside me, and Greg was on the floor shaking, and I said, what in the world is going on? I'm thinking, what have we gotten into here?
And he's out cold, but he's kind of shaking. And well, I quickly ended the interview, thanked my guest, wrapped it up, say, thanks for joining us, have a great meeting. Boom, we were done. And I was actually a little angry at Greg, who was the staff member who was on the floor at the moment, for not maintaining his composure in a professional environment. And so it's pretty common that when we had a guest in the studio in those days, especially a visiting pastor, we would just have a moment of prayer. So we kind of stood there in the studio for a minute, and I thanked them. We had a word of prayer. I would say nothing remarkable happened except one thing. One of the other staff members who was with me received prayer, and he's there for prayer, and he hits the deck, and he's on the ground. Now, this guy came from a very non-charismatic, very traditional evangelical background, had never really experienced anything, had no paradigm from which to place it. So again, I was a little surprised, but I knew it was genuine because I knew where he was coming from and what his experiences were. So we stayed in the studio, and the longer we were there, the more that sense of the Lord's presence began to grow. There was like kind of just a sense of awe.
And then after a little while, John announced, hey folks, God's doing something here. You might want to come by if you want prayer.
Just said very simply, our staff have been praying together today. And I just want to say that if you've got a need in your life, something going on, you feel like your back's against a wall, if you want to come to our radio studios, we'll pray with you personally today. And I don't think I said much more than that. And I did not know if nobody would show up or if anybody would come, but within the first few minutes, a young man came in and said he heard the announcement and he just really felt compelled to get there as quickly as he could. And so they invited him into the studio. And so I reached out to pray for him, and before my hand could even I was just gonna put my hand on his shoulder in kind of a comforting way. Man, he hit the deck. And he was just under I was concerned, first of all, he would be injured. Secondarily, he's just obviously something dramatically happening. Well, one by one, people started coming in. Within just a few minutes, literally the studio was full of people. And it was a very large studio. I mean, it was an unusually large studio. I think it probably was maybe a 20 by 20 room. A pretty good size for a radio studio. So it was full within a short period of time. And everybody who would come in, it was a similar situation. It didn't matter who prayed. Several of my staff were in the room. Larry had the idea that what we needed to do at that particular point in time was to just look, because the studio was full, is take everybody into the church.
Let's go from this room to the auditorium, which is right across the hall, probably not more than 40 feet, 50 feet maybe. And it was as though we were carrying, when we made that transition from one room to the next, it was as though we were carrying something sacred and holy. We didn't even want to walk fast, just very cautiously move, like we were carrying, as I mentioned, like the Ark of the Covenant. Didn't want to stumble for sure there. And so we went to the auditorium, and when we made more room for the Holy Spirit to work, by golly, he showed up and did some amazing things.
I remember seeing kids keep their hands in the air for like 2 hours, just laying on the floor. 6, 7, 8-year-olds. And then as I walked around the room, I would hear one kid in one side of the room describing a vision, and then I would walk to the other side of the room where these guys were totally out of earshot, because it's a pretty big auditorium, and the other kid was describing verbatim the exact same vision. So you had kids on either side of the room having the exact same vision. And this had continued, and then as people get prayed for it, and then they would get up off the floor after a while, one of the first things they would do is they'd get on the phone, they'd start calling their friends, or they'd call their pastors. So in a short period of time, pastors started coming in, area pastors, a lot of these people I knew. I remember seeing one pastor come in who I knew from a theological perspective probably would not be inclined to go along with these shenanigans. And I was a little nervous, so I started to go and greet him. And he looked at me and he had tears streaming down his face, and he said, "This is God." So he came forward, and I don't remember who prayed for him, one of our staff members, or it didn't matter who was doing the praying. At this point, there were a lot of people praying. I mean, everybody was praying for everybody. And man, that guy hit the deck. And God, you could just see something marvelous that God was doing in him. And when he got up off the floor, he had a resolve in his eyes, and then he was laying hands on people as they were coming in.
I walked in, went up forward, got prayed for, boom, hit the carpet. Got up and just started praying for people. The day went on that way, boom, one after another, people were coming in. Some people you'd recognize, so many people we never saw before.
It was like there was an unseen hand directing everybody. Nobody was in charge. We really gave very little instructions, because there wasn't really instructions to, we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know what we were doing. But we do know that what felt to us was the mandate from the Lord was pray for people. And people kept coming. They came by the hundreds in the building. Pretty soon that entire auditorium was wall to wall with people on their face, some weeping, some crying, some completely unconscious, some with their hands in the air, for some for hours. Then all of a sudden, a woman began to shriek. I mean, I thought something was wrong. I thought, shriek, "I'm healed, I'm healed, I'm healed." She could move her hands. She had apparently had severe crippling arthritis and wasn't able to move her hands. And she was one of the first that I remember. Someone else was healed of multiple things. I remember someone else immediately saying that they were no longer in pain from a crippling back condition. But we took it live on the air. We had the capability of just putting the microphone on the piano and the microphone on the, obviously a vocal microphone, and we put it live on the air. And so when people were tuning to the radio station, all I heard was Michael on the piano worshiping. And so it was like, what is this? I mean, where's Carmen? You know, whatever. That's how long ago it was. And people were like, people would come and they would say things like, I was just driving down the road, I just heard the worship, and I just felt like I had to come to the building. We weren't even really making a lot of announcements at that point. It was just kind of happening live, and people were coming. I remember a guy who was driving a Coca-Cola truck up I-95 telling us when he came, he said, he turned the radio on and the Holy Spirit flooded into his cab, so much so that he had to pull the truck off to the side of the road and get his composure to be able to control, on the interstate. He just knew where he needed to go. And he literally took the Vero Beach exit. We're 3 miles straight down the road from there. He found us and came in. I would say that story is isolated, but it wasn't. We heard that over and over and over. I know of people who were sitting at the gym listening to their Sony Walkman, and all of a sudden they couldn't work out. They were just overcome by the presence of the Lord, and they came. And it continued well through the day, and all this was going on. And finally, it was getting close to the evening, and the tabernacle was scheduled to have a meeting that night, and these guys needed to get back up there to obviously do the meeting. And so we made an announcement, said, guys, we're going to take it all up the tab. We're going to shut this down in a few minutes, and everybody go up there, and we'll continue it there. So, which is what we did. I left. I remember getting up there, and I remember when I got close to the church there in Melbourne, off of Aurora and Ferndale, and when I was probably parked my car, it seems to me I was a block away because there were so many cars. I remember Ferndale was completely shut down. There was nobody on Ferndale whatsoever on the road. And as I walked towards the church, when I was still a pretty good distance away, there were people laying in the grass and on the concrete. I don't think that anybody had prayed for them. I just believe that as they were approaching the building, something happened. They had an experience, and boom. And so by the time I got there, the building was totally packed. And somebody, I don't know who, had the brilliant idea of actually setting up a screen on the street. And they were in the process of setting up a screen on the street so that the crowd who were in the street trying to get into the church building, I just pictured this, could experience what was going on. And again, you were stepping over bodies as you approached the church.
Well, fast forward just about 3 weeks, I was in the auditorium and I was going to the sound booth, and a lady who was visiting the school stopped me and she said, excuse me, and I said, yes, ma'am. She said, you don't remember me probably, but I was here on that Friday when you guys were praying with people. I said, oh, yes. She said, well, you had prayer for my daughter, and she's been healed. And I said, well, great, that's wonderful. I was excited for her. She said, you don't understand. She said, a few years before, my daughter was violently raped. And ever since then, she's been on medication just to go to sleep at night. And just the other day, after the prayer, she's called me and she said, Mom, I don't have to take the medication anymore. God's healed me.
And so she had been on meds for years. She was unable to eat properly. She was a nervous wreck. She couldn't socialize. She couldn't do anything. That so traumatically struck her. And when Larry shared that, the Lord just said, don't put me in a box. Just because you don't see it that way doesn't mean I'm not doing things. And for me, that was the biggest lesson that day. The whole day was phenomenal.
God delivered them that day, and to this day they're free. This person still attends our church, know this person well. Many stories like this during that particular day. I spent a lot of the next year doing meetings in which the Lord really moved in a marvelous way. It was wonderful. We saw God do incredible things. And in Vero Beach, we started doing regular meetings in which the community would come in and the power of the Lord would just move in dramatic, incredible ways. We saw a lot of churches impacted. A lot of it was wonderful. Some of it was hard because I know of churches that went through church splits over this stuff. There were at least 3 Baptist churches I know that sort of moved from a cessationist theology to a spirit-filled theology, to believing in the manifestation power of God and God healing, because they were experiencing God healing. They were experiencing the gifts of the Spirit in operation suddenly. And so it was. I remember having a phone call from some board member who was just so angry at me for ruining their church. I'm like, I didn't do it. I really didn't plan it. I didn't do it. There were, I can't even tell you how many churches were dramatically impacted in our area during that. We went on, and we could spend the rest of the day talking about the other events that happened, other meetings we were in, things that God did subsequently. But night after night after night, we saw God do things at the Tab. We saw God do things here, multiple things in other churches as well. In the years since, we all realized something. Our lives dramatically changed on January 6, 1995. None of us was ever the same again.
But it did transform our lives. It did change everything. It changed how we raised our kids. It changed how I did my business. It changed my relationship with my wife. It changed everything.
It was as if, in the moment, that we suddenly became cognizant of weapons that were at our side, that had been at our side all along. I remember having that sensation that I was aware of spiritual abilities and I was aware of spiritual gifts. It was almost like suddenly I saw myself equipped with all kinds of armor and a sword and all this stuff. And I know I'm using scriptural visualization, but that was literally what I was seeing. And yet it occurred to me in that moment, they've always been there. I just wasn't aware of it.